At the family barbecue that was supposed to be nothing more than a sunny afternoon of grilled food, kids laughing, and neighbors dropping by with side dishes, my entire world tilted in a way I could never have imagined. One moment, I was balancing a plate of potato salad, listening to my uncle joke about the weather, and the next, I saw my sister Hannah rise from the picnic bench with an expression that froze the blood in my veins. Her eyes were colder than I had ever seen them. Not playful, not angry in the ordinary way siblings fight, but empty, detached, almost like a soldier executing an order. She looked at her German Shepherd Zeus, a dog she always bragged about training, and her voice cut through the hum of chatter like a blade, sharp and terrifying. She shouted a command I never expected to hear at a family gathering. Zeus, bite. It felt like the air was punched out of my lungs. For a split second, I thought I had misheard that maybe she said sit or stay, one of those harmless words you say to a dog when children are nearby. But then Zeus lunged, powerful muscles propelling him across the grass, and before I could react, his teeth clamped into my leg just above the knee. The pain was instant blinding, and I screamed as my plate crashed to the ground. The shock of his jaws locked on my flesh made me stumble backward, collapsing against the side of the wooden bench, my hands instinctively clawing at his collar, but his weight bore me down. I could feel warmth spreading down my shin, my sandals slipping on the brick patio as my world turned into a blur of screaming voices and sharp, searing agony. Children shrieked, running for the house, their high-pitched cries piercing the summer air. My aunt dropped her drink glass, shattering against the concrete. Neighbors peered over the fence, wide-eyed, unsure if what they were seeing was real. My cousin tried to move toward me but froze when Zeus growled a sound so deep it shook my bones. And then came the words that cut deeper than the bite itself. My parents, my mother. Linda, hands clenched at her chest, shouted not in horror for me, not in worry for her younger daughter bleeding on the patio, but in support of Hannah. She yelled out with a certainty that twisted my heart. She did right. My father Richard echoed his voice booming like some kind of judge sealing a verdict. This is what you deserved. Those words rang louder in my head than the growl of the dog, louder than the panicked voices of the neighbors, louder even than my own scream. I was not just under attack from a German shepherd. I was under attack from my own blood, my own family, who chose to defend the person commanding the violence instead of the one lying on the ground in pain. That was the first twist of the knife, not physical, but emotional, the betrayal that had been simmering for years, suddenly exploding into the open in front of everyone. The smell of grilled meat and charcoal clung to the air, but all I could smell was fear, all I could taste was copper on my tongue as I bit back another scream. My hands shook as I tried to push Zeus away, his claws scraping the fabric of my summer dress. My body felt heavy, pinned not only by his weight, but by the weight of my parents' approval of Hannah's cruelty. I heard my cousin yell at Hannah to call the dog off, but Hannah just stood there, her lips curling into a smirk. Her eyes locked on me as if this was the victory she had been waiting for. It was not a random accident. It was a message. My chest tightened with panic as I realized this was premeditated and I was the target. The dog was not just a pet, not just a family companion, but a weapon. I could feel his teeth loosening as someone finally pulled at his leash, but the damage was done, the warm wetness soaking my leg proof of that. As I gasped for air, the crowd of relatives blurred around me. Some were yelling to call 911. Others were frozen, torn between siding with the daughter crying on the ground, or the daughter standing proudly with her loyal dog. My parents had already chosen their side, and in that moment, I understood just how alone I truly was. The chaos was overwhelming voices, overlapping dishes, falling children crying from behind the sliding glass door. My body trembled with a cocktail of pain and disbelief, not just from the wound, but from the confirmation that my parents would rather watch me bleed than confront Hannah. Emotional undulation hit me like a wave. Pain surged, then despair pulled me under, then anger ignited only to be doused again by the crushing realization of betrayal. I wanted to shout at them to demand why they were siding with cruelty. But all that came out of my mouth was a choked sob as I clutched my leg. In the corner of my eye, I saw a neighbor lift his phone, filming. The thought raced through me like fire. At least there would be proof. Proof that Hannah had ordered it, proof that my parents had cheered it, proof that I had not imagined this nightmare. I pressed my palm against the bite, trying to stem the bleeding, my skin slick, my breath uneven. The sun still shone, the grill still smoked, but the entire scene felt tainted, as if the ground beneath the picnic table had turned into a stage where the ugly truth of my family was finally on display. I could hear Linda's voice again, not trembling with fear, but strong, certain. She did right. That refrain echoed in my mind a mantra of cruelty, a stamp of approval for violence, a sentence that would haunt me far longer than the scar forming on my leg. And Richard, with his arms crossed, nodding in agreement, as though his eldest daughter's command of a dog was justice served. I realized then that this was not about the dog at all. It was about control, about silencing me, about reminding me of my place in a family where loyalty was not earned but demanded, where speaking out or simply existing as myself was enough to make me a target. As I struggled to sit up, the world still spinning, I locked eyes with Hannah. She did not look away. Her stare was triumphant, a declaration without words. I own this moment. You are nothing. My pulse pounded in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The bite had torn into my leg, but the deeper wound was invisible, carved into my trust, into my identity, into the fragile bond I once thought family meant. In that instant, I knew the barbecue was no longer a family gathering. It was a battlefield, and I had just been marked as the enemy. The moment Zeus was pulled back and my body crumpled against the bench, the chaos erupted like a wildfire, uncontrolled and searing through every corner of the backyard. Voices collided in the humid summer air, some shouting for help, others pointing fingers, and in the middle of it all, I lay gripping my leg, the sting of betrayal burning hotter than the wound itself. I could hear my mother Linda's shrill voice above the noise, not trembling with fear, but laced with conviction as she called Hannah her strong daughter, her pride, the one who finally stood up and acted. My father Richard added his own booming approval, telling everyone to calm down because Hannah had only done what needed to be done. Those words twisted inside me deeper than any tooth mark because they were not random shouts in the heat of panic. They were judgments, verdicts handed down like law from the two people who were supposed to protect me. Around me, cousins argued in frantic circles. My cousin Sarah knelt halfway toward me, hands hovering as if she wanted to help, but pulled back when Richard barked at her to stay away. Another cousin Mike shouted that we needed to call 911 immediately, but his own father told him not to interfere in family business. The split was visible, a line drawn in the backyard, where some stood frozen near the grill, loyal to my parents and Hannah, while others clustered near the gate, torn between fear of Zeus and the horror of what had just happened. I tried to push myself up, but the weight of their words pressed me down harder than gravity. The dog bite throbbed sharp pulses of pain that made my vision blur. But worse was the way my mind began to twist against itself. Years of gaslighting had trained me to doubt, to turn every injury into something I might have provoked. I heard myself thinking, did I say something wrong earlier? Did I roll my eyes? Did I somehow make Hannah snap? The insidious voice of doubt, seated by decades of subtle digs from my family, rose louder than the cries for help. Maybe this really was my fault. The thought was suffocating. I looked around through watery eyes, searching for even one face of certainty, someone who would anchor me back to reality. I caught the neighbor's worried stare through the fence, his phone still in hand, but even that brought no comfort, because I remembered how quickly stories can be twisted. A video could be spun, words could be cut, and who would the community believe, the favored eldest daughter with her polished smile and obedient dog? Or the younger one labeled dramatic, difficult, always too sensitive? My body shook as a wave of fear and humiliation crashed over me. The smell of food that had moments ago been appetizing now made me nauseous. Children's sobs filtered from the house, muffled behind the glass door, their little palms pressed to the window. They had seen their aunt attacked, but also seen their grandparents cheering, and I wondered what kind of memory that would carve into their young minds. My chest ached with a question that would not leave me. What kind of family does this? I clenched my fists and tried to pull myself back from that spiral, but the shouting around me only pulled me deeper. Hannah stood tall, brushing her hair off her shoulder as though nothing extraordinary had happened, and every time someone tried to move toward me, she gave Zeus a tug on the leash, a silent warning that he was still there, still ready if she chose to let him loose again. My father pointed a finger at me, declaring to anyone who would listen that I had provoked Hannah, that I had mocked her earlier and pushed her too far. I searched my memory in panic, combing through every word I had said that morning. I had only complimented her dress and asked if she needed help with the grill. Nothing more yet. In his retelling, it became evidence of me needling, undermining, making trouble. The unfairness was staggering, but still the question lodged in my throat, could he be right? I hated myself for even entertaining it, but that was the poison of living under their roof for so long. The moment I tried to think clearly, their voices drowned me out, and even now bleeding on the ground, I felt the pull to surrender to their version of events. Neighbors started stepping closer, their hesitation breaking as the scene dragged on too long. One woman whispered that she would testify if needed that she had heard the command clearly, but her husband tugged her arm, worried about getting entangled in family drama. My cousin Sarah cried openly now, begging someone to do something while Linda pulled her close, scolding her for embarrassing the family with tears. That sight cut me as sharply as the bite my mother comforting someone else while I sat trembling, ignored, dismissed. The crowd felt like a jury whispering, debating, and I was on trial without defense. The physical pain roared each time I shifted, but even that felt secondary to the suffocating sense of being isolated, abandoned in plain sight. My head spun as anger flickered for a moment, a spark that whispered I had done nothing wrong, that this was Hannah's cruelty and my parents' choice. The spark flared when I locked eyes with Sarah again, her lips trembling with the words she could not say. Then just as quickly the spark dimmed when Richard barked that I was faking the severity, that the bite was a scratch, that I should stop acting. My body sagged against the bench as hopelessness rolled back in. Emotional undulation whipped me back and forth. Shock, anger, despair, disbelief, all cycling so fast I could barely breathe. I pressed my palm against my wound, trying to steady myself, trying to keep some control, but control had never been allowed to me in this family. My parents had seized it. Hannah had perfected it, and I was left gasping for fragments of truth in the swirl of lies. The noise swelled again, cousins snapping at one another, neighbors murmuring about whether to intervene, the dog pacing with a low growl, and through it all, I kept hearing my mother's praise. My father's verdict echoing again and again like a curse. She did right. She did right. Each repetition felt like a hammer striking the fragile shell of my sanity. I had to grip the edge of the bench to remind myself that I was still here, that my body was not lying, that the pain in my leg was real, and that no amount of twisted words could erase the truth of what just happened. But doubt still gnawed, and as the arguments swirled above me, I felt like a ghost in my own family story, unheard, unseen, except as the scapegoat they needed me to be. That realization weighed on me heavier than Zeus's body had moments before, and I knew in my bones that the path ahead would not just be about healing a wound, but about proving my existence in a family that had already written me out of its narrative. As I pressed my trembling hands against my leg, trying to keep myself grounded in the present, the swirl of voices and accusations around me began to blur into the background, and what rose in my mind instead were memories sharp and relentless, each one a fragment of the truth I had been ignoring for years. The attack with the German Shepherd was not an isolated moment born of impulse. It was the natural conclusion of a lifetime of resentment and hostility that my sister Hannah had harbored toward me, encouraged silently and sometimes loudly by my parents Linda and Richard. Even through the haze of pain, I could see Hannah standing tall by the grill, one hand on Zeus's collar, and the image pulled me back to childhood scenes where the imbalance of love and attention had already been scripted. I was 10 years old when I first realized I was the lesser child. At birthday parties, Hannah received the bigger cake slices, the louder applause, the gifts that sparkled while mine were an afterthought. I remember one afternoon in middle school when I had studied for weeks for a spelling bee and made it to the final round. As I stood on stage, clutching the microphone, my mother's eyes never left Hannah, who sat in the front row as if the real achievement was simply Hannah's presence rather than my effort. When I lost by a single letter, Linda shook her head and muttered that maybe I should focus on chores instead of embarrassing the family. That sting returned now, as fresh as the bite on my leg. The years piled one over another, each carrying its own scar. When I was 15, Richard caught Hannah sneaking out past curfew, yet instead of grounding her, he barged into my room and accused me of being a bad influence, slapping the back of my head so hard my ears rang. Hannah smirked in the hallway untouched, as though her mischief was invisible. The memory of his heavy footsteps and my own stifled tears came back now, reminding me that the roots of today's cruelty were deep and watered regularly. I remembered a time in high school when I had earned a small scholarship offer for a summer art program. Excited, I left the acceptance letter on the kitchen counter only to find it missing the next day. Weeks later, I overheard Hannah giggling with her friends about how she had taken it and shredded it because she could not stand the idea of me being praised. When I confronted her, she shrugged and said it did not matter because Mom and Dad would never have let me go anyway. She was right. Linda told me flatly that art was a waste of time, that the family needed me home to help, and Richard added that Hannah's debate team required the household budget more than my silly hobby. The art program became another ghost of what might have been. As I sat on the patio now, the echo of their old dismissals rang inside me louder than the shouting cousins. I saw Hannah's triumphant smirk as if overlaid with all the smirks of years past every time she sabotaged, every time she whispered lies that I could never disprove. She had always known exactly where to twist the knife, and my parents had always applauded her precision. One memory in particular seared through me like fire. I was 17 and had stayed up all night writing an essay for a college application. I had left my notes spread across the dining table and went to shower. When I returned, half the pages were missing. Hannah sat at the counter sipping orange juice with a sly grin, telling me she thought the papers were trash and tossed them in the fireplace. I cried, panicked, trying to salvage scraps of burnt words. Linda walked in, saw the mess, and instead of scolding Hannah, she scolded me for making a scene. Richard told me I should have been more careful with my belongings. I ended up submitting a rushed essay and never heard back from that college. Tonight, as I bled in the backyard, I understood that this pattern had never ended. The dog command was not sudden, it was simply another variation of Hannah's lifelong project, ensuring that I never rose, that every attempt I made to stand taller was met with a force determined to cut me down. My parents were not bystanders in this project. They were architects. They had trained me to doubt myself, to accept the role of scapegoat. Every slap, every scolding, every dismissive comment had been bricks laid in the wall that trapped me in silence. My mind cycled through images of me cleaning while Hannah lounged me cooking dinner at 14, while Hannah was allowed to study undisturbed, me watching from the bleachers as my parents cheered her on in debate tournaments while barely noticing when I played the violin in a school recital. I had accepted these injustices then because to resist meant more punishment. But now, with blood soaking my summer dress, I saw clearly that acceptance had only encouraged them. Emotional undulation surged again. Pain from my leg, despair from memory, then anger blooming hot and uncontrollable. I wanted to scream across the yard that this was not new, that this was decades in the making, that Hannah had been jealous since we were children and my parents had enabled her. I wanted to stand and shout that I was done playing the role they assigned me, but the weight of years pressed hard. My throat tightened with the remembered words of my mother saying, "Stop being dramatic." My father saying, "You always exaggerate." Their voices whispered in my mind, even now, muting my own. I felt rage surge, then doubt smother it, then rage again. I pressed my palm harder to my wound, not just to slow the bleeding, but to anchor myself against the storm of memory and manipulation. In that moment, I realized something chilling. Hannah had not lost control when she commanded Zeus. She had never been more in control. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she knew our parents would not only forgive it, but cheer it. She had been preparing this moment, testing boundaries for years with little acts of sabotage and cruelty, and each time she got away with it, she became bolder. The bite was the culmination of years of unchecked malice. As I glanced at her face, now lit by the late afternoon sun, I saw not just my sister, but the embodiment of every injustice I had swallowed. And though I trembled with pain and fear, I also felt the first stirrings of clarity. This was not about me being too sensitive or dramatic. This was about survival in a family that had marked me as expendable. That clarity frightened me, but also steadied me. For the first time, I thought perhaps I was not crazy. Perhaps I was not to blame. Perhaps the problem was a system designed against me from the beginning. That realization was a quiet twist, not explosive like the dog's bite, but sharp and cutting in its own way. The truth had always been there, I had just been conditioned to ignore it. Now I could not. Not after this. The memories of lost opportunities, sabotaged achievements, stolen chances swirled like ghosts around me. Each one whispered that the bite was not random, that it was the physical manifestation of Hannah's lifelong mission to erase me. And as I sat trembling on the patio surrounded by chaos, I knew that the fight was no longer about a single wound. It was about every scar they had forced me to carry, and about whether I would let them write the ending of my story. The patio was still humming with the shouts of cousins and neighbors when I noticed Hannah's hand drifting toward the picnic table, and in that moment, every nerve in my body screamed louder than the wound in my leg. The knife we had used to slice steaks earlier was lying there, gleaming faintly in the sun, still smeared with grease. My pulse spiked as I realized she was reaching for it, her fingers curling like a spider ready to strike. My breath caught, and I felt time stretch in slow motion as if the world was holding its breath with me. The dog attack had been brutal, but this felt like a step into something even darker, something irreversible. Hannah's face was calm, almost too calm, like she had rehearsed this moment, like commanding the dog was only the opening act. I struggled against the bench, forcing my body upright despite the fire in my leg, and with a surge of adrenaline, I swung my foot against the edge of the picnic table. Plates clattered, plastic cups spilled lemonade across the grass, and the greasy knife clattered onto the ground, spinning out of Hannah's reach. Gasps erupted around me, some cousins shouting my name, others shouting hers, but above it all came Linda's sharp voice, loud enough to pierce the chaos. "Claire is making a scene," she screamed, as if the sight of her younger daughter bleeding and defending herself was nothing more than drama at a family party. Richard's voice followed, booming with authority, accusing me of attacking Hannah, of turning a simple gathering into a spectacle. My body trembled with fury at the absurdity of their words. I had just been bitten, nearly maimed, and now they were painting me as the aggressor. Emotional undulation whiplashed me again. Terror at the thought of the knife, followed by relief that it had fallen away. Then outrage at the gaslighting that twisted everything upside down. Hannah lunged for the fallen blade, but my cousin Mike intercepted, kicking it further into the grass. His face was pale, his hands shaking, but he stood between us like a barrier. For a moment, our eyes met, and I saw in his expression the acknowledgement of reality, the validation that I was not imagining this. Yet even as relief fluttered in my chest, my parents drowned it out, yelling at Mike to step aside, yelling that Hannah was the victim. Neighbors clustered near the fence, whispering to each other, their eyes wide, their phones in hand. I heard one of them mutter that this was madness, that they had never seen anything like it. The air was thick with smoke from the grill, but it felt poisoned by accusation and betrayal. My legs wobbled, the wound throbbing, but I forced myself to stand, gripping the bench for balance. My voice came out hoarse, but loud enough to cut through the shouting. She tried to stab me. That sentence hung in the air, raw and undeniable. Yet Linda was quick to twist it. "Claire is hysterical," she insisted, waving her arms as though to erase the truth. Richard nodded in agreement, his face red with anger, calling me dramatic, saying I always turned small things into catastrophes. The fury in me boiled, and for once I refused to swallow it. My leg hurt. My head spun, but I would not let them rewrite this. I pointed at the knife lying in the grass and shouted that everyone saw it, that Hannah had reached for it after unleashing the dog. Some cousins nodded reluctantly. Others looked down, torn between the weight of truth and the fear of crossing my parents. Zeus growled low again, sensing the tension, his ears pinned back as Hannah tugged at his collar, her eyes burning into me with unspoken hatred. She looked almost disappointed, as if the knife slipping away had robbed her of the climax she craved. That realization chilled me more than the bite, more than the wound. This was not just about silencing me. It was about escalation, about proving her dominance in front of every witness. Emotional undulations surged again. For a heartbeat, I felt powerful standing despite the pain, defying their narrative, calling out the truth. Then the wave of gaslighting crashed back, my mother's shrill accusations, my father's thundering judgments, the cousins shifting uncomfortably, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. My voice faltered, my certainty cracked, and doubt seeped in again. Maybe no one would believe me. Maybe they would all remember this day as Claire losing control. My chest tightened. My hands shook, but then I caught the eyes of a neighbor through the fence. Her phone raised, recording. The thought struck like lightning there would be proof. No matter how much Linda and Richard twisted the story, no matter how loudly they defended Hannah, the truth was being captured. That gave me a flicker of strength, a fragile rope to cling to. Hannah's voice sliced through the yard, cold and steady. "You don't belong here." Those 4 words hit harder than Zeus's teeth, harder than Richard's insults, harder than Linda's dismissal. They were the distillation of everything my family had ever made me feel. Unwanted, expendable, a mistake. My knees buckled and I nearly collapsed, but I caught myself on the bench again, refusing to give her the satisfaction. The cousins murmured, the neighbors whispered, and the knife glinted in the grass like a silent witness to the madness. I drew a shaky breath, fighting back the sob rising in my throat, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. I was done begging for their approval. I was done doubting what my own eyes saw and my body felt. They could shout and accuse and twist the story, but I had lived the truth, and no amount of gaslighting could erase the scar already carved into my leg. That realization was a turning point, fragile but real, and though the chaos raged around me, I felt a new kind of resolve take root. I did not know yet how I would fight back, but I knew this much: I would never let them convince me again that my pain was imaginary. The dog bite was real. The knife was real. The betrayal was real. And from this moment on, so was my resistance. The shouting had reached a fever pitch when the first wail of sirens drifted faintly through the humid air, and for a moment the yard went still, as if everyone recognized that the chaos inside our family was about to be exposed to the outside world. My heart hammered as red and blue lights flickered against the siding of the house, and then the gate creaked open as 2 police officers stepped in, followed by EMTs carrying their bags. The shift in atmosphere was immediate. Voices that had been booming seconds earlier dropped to murmurs. Cousins scattered back. Neighbors straightened their shoulders as if to look respectable, and I clutched the bench for balance, my leg throbbing but my focus sharpening. The EMTs moved toward me instinctively, but Linda blocked their path, waving her arms and insisting that I was exaggerating, that the dog barely touched me, that I was making a fool of myself. Her words sliced at me with the same cruelty as before, but now there were witnesses who were not family. The lead officer, a tall man with a steady gaze, raised his hand and told her firmly to step aside. Still, Linda argued, calling me dramatic, and Richard chimed in that Hannah had acted responsibly, that I had provoked everything. My throat tightened, the familiar script playing out, but the officer's expression did not waver. He crouched down beside me, asking my name, and when I whispered Claire Thompson through gritted teeth, he nodded and signaled for the EMTs. Their hands were gentle as they peeled my blood-stained dress from the wound, wrapping gauze around my leg, while I bit my lip to keep from crying out. The contrast was almost unbearable, the quiet efficiency of strangers caring for me while my own parents hissed that I was wasting everyone's time. Emotional undulation struck again, a flicker of relief that someone finally took me seriously, drowned quickly by the humiliation of my parents shouting over me, painting me as the villain. Detective Leah Waywright arrived moments later, her presence commanding in a way that silenced even Richard for a beat. She scanned the scene with sharp eyes, taking in the toppled table, the scattered food, the knife glinting in the grass, and Zeus still straining against Hannah's grip. She pulled a small notebook from her jacket, kneeling just far enough to meet my eyes. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said calmly, and the steadiness in her tone cracked something in me. My voice shook as I recounted how Hannah had shouted the command, how Zeus had lunged, how my parents had cheered. Each word felt like dragging barbed wire from my throat because part of me still expected the detective to roll her eyes to side with my family to call me dramatic. But she only wrote, nodding occasionally, her face unreadable but attentive. A neighbor spoke up suddenly, a man I barely knew, saying he had heard Hannah's exact words. His wife added that she had seen Hannah's hand reaching for the knife. The flood of validation hit me with such force I nearly sobbed, but before relief could root itself, Linda shrieked that they were lying, that the neighbors had always been jealous of our family. Richard added that people loved to twist stories. The tension grew thick again, my moment of hope smothered by their accusations. Yet the detective did not dismiss the witnesses. She asked for their names, their phone numbers, writing it all down. Emotional undulation pulled me upward again, fragile but real. The EMT pressed more gauze against my leg, murmuring that I needed stitches, and when I flinched at the sting, she told me softly that it would be okay. The softness contrasted so violently with my mother's voice behind her scolding me for being weak that I felt dizzy. Hannah stood silent now, lips pressed thin, her hand tight on Zeus's collar, and I wondered if she was calculating, if she was deciding whether to spin a story of her own. But Detective Waywright's gaze kept flicking to her, and each time their eyes met, I saw Hannah's confidence crack just a little. My father tried to seize the stage, booming at the detective that the family could handle this privately, that no charges were needed, but the detective cut him off with a firmness that sent shivers down my spine. "Sir," she said, "this is no longer private. This is assault." The word hung heavy in the yard, undeniable, echoing in my ears like a verdict. Richard's face reddened, his mouth opening and closing with no retort, and Linda sputtered about family loyalty. Emotional undulation surged again, disbelief that anyone outside my family could call it what it was. Then relief, then fear of what retaliation might come. The gauze on my leg was turning red fast, and the EMT told me again that I needed to be transported to the hospital. I nodded weakly, but before they lifted me, I forced myself to point at Hannah. She gave the order. I said, my voice cracking but clear. The detective wrote it down without hesitation, then turned to Hannah directly. "Is that true?" The silence was deafening, and Hannah's lips curled into a practiced smile as she claimed she had been protecting the children, that I had startled the dog, that she was only trying to keep everyone safe. The blatant lie made my stomach churn, but before despair could consume me, the neighbor interrupted again, his voice stronger this time, insisting that everyone had heard the word she used. More neighbors nodded reluctantly, courage building, and their support steadied me like a hand on my shoulder. My parents shouted again, calling it all fabrication, but the detective only nodded and said we would gather all statements. Emotional undulation crashed over me once more, the chaos pressing in, the betrayal searing. But underneath it, a new thread wove itself into my heart. For the first time, there was a record beyond my family's twisted narrative. There was proof that I was not invisible, not crazy, not alone. As the EMTs lifted me onto the stretcher, the detective's eyes met mine, and she gave the smallest nod as if to say, "We will get to the bottom of this." That nod carried me through the blur of pain and humiliation, a fragile lifeline in the storm. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and flashing lights outside the window, but my mind refused to rest, replaying the image of Hannah's face as she shouted the command, the sound of my parents cheering, the knife glinting in the grass. By the time the EMTs wheeled me into the emergency room, my head was heavy with those echoes, but the doctors were swift, stitching the bite on my leg, cleaning the wound, asking me to describe the attack while typing notes into the computer. Every detail they recorded felt like a shield being built around me, a tangible record that could not be twisted by my parents' words. When Detective Leah Waywright arrived at the hospital hours later carrying her notebook and a small evidence bag, my stomach tightened with both dread and hope. She explained calmly that she had already collected initial statements from the neighbors and several cousins that the knife had been bagged and that animal control had been notified about Zeus. Her voice was measured, but underneath I could hear the weight of seriousness. She told me plainly that this was not going to disappear into family silence. That was both terrifying and liberating. Emotional undulation rolled through me relief that someone was taking me seriously, fear of the storm that would follow once my family realized they could not contain it. When she asked if I had anyone outside of family who could help, I gave her Mark Stevens's name. Mark had been my closest friend since college, someone my parents disliked because he encouraged me to stand up for myself, which was precisely why I trusted him. She made a note and told me she might need to speak with him. Later that night, Mark appeared at my bedside, his expression grim but resolute, and he listened as I haltingly described what had happened. His first words were not disbelief or pity, but simple determination, "We'll get proof." That sentence became a lifeline. The next day, Mark returned with a small USB drive. He explained that he had spoken to a neighbor who had security cameras pointed toward the yard and convinced them to let him copy the footage. My heart pounded as I watched on his laptop the grainy video that captured Hannah standing, her voice audible through the microphone, the clear command to Zeus, the lunge, my collapse. My throat tightened, tears spilling, because there it was, undeniable, not twisted through Linda's words, not shouted over by Richard, but real, raw, recorded. Detective Waywright's eyes sharpened when she saw it, and she said this would be critical. Emotional undulation surged with vindication, only to dip again when she told me Hannah had already begun spinning her own story, claiming I had taunted the dog, that she had simply reacted to protect the children. I clenched my fists, anger shaking me, but then the detective revealed something more chilling. While following up, she had requested access to Hannah's training records for Zeus and discovered an unsettling note. In one session recorded by the trainer's assistant, Hannah had specifically rehearsed the command with my name in the sentence conditioning Zeus to associate me with aggression. My stomach dropped. That meant she had planned this not as an accident, not as heat of the moment, but as deliberate targeting. I felt sick but also strangely steady because the proof was stacking up. Then the detective opened the evidence bag and pulled out a printed email she had found on Hannah's laptop during a preliminary search warrant. It was from Linda to Hannah lines that made my skin crawl. "If she resists again, show her she doesn't belong." The words stared back at me like a scar proof that my parents were not merely bystanders but participants. My chest heaved with disbelief, anger clawing at my insides. Emotional undulation tore through me again, fury that they could be so blatant, despair at how deep the betrayal went, and a strange relief that at last the hidden alliance was exposed. Mark sat beside me, gripping my hand, whispering that now we had them now, no one could deny it. But part of me still quaked, afraid that somehow Linda and Richard would twist even this into something excusable. Detective Waywright assured me they were cataloging every piece, building a timeline. Over the next days, she uncovered more. A cousin nervously admitted that weeks earlier, Hannah had joked about using Zeus to keep Claire in line, and another confessed that they had seen Linda whispering with Hannah before the barbecue, both glancing toward me. Piece by piece, the puzzle took shape, and with each new revelation, the narrative shifted further from family squabble to orchestrated attack. Yet, as the case grew stronger, so did the pressure. Social media lit up with half-truths and gossip, my family whispering to anyone who would listen that I was unstable, dramatic, looking for attention. The weight pressed on me, emotional undulation, tugging me down again. But every time I faltered, Mark reminded me of the video of the email of the training record, facts that even my parents could not erase. One night, while reviewing notes, Mark played a recording from a training session where Hannah's voice was captured clear as day, commanding Zeus, and when he paused it, he looked at me and said, "She trained him for you." The words were like a dagger, but also a torch. They cut, but they illuminated. This had never been about a dog losing control. This was about a family determined to control me. I lay awake in the hospital bed that night, leg aching, mind racing, but for the first time in years, I felt clarity. Their secrets were surfacing, their patterns exposed. They had built a system of silence, but now cracks were spreading. I vowed in that sterile room that I would not let them bury me under lies again. This time, I would fight armed not only with pain, but with proof. By the time I was released from the hospital with my leg stitched and wrapped, the story had already spread beyond the backyard, carried by whispers and amplified by screams. The first sign was a notification on my phone as I sat in the passenger seat of Mark's car. A local community forum had a post titled, "Sister's BBQ Turns Bloody." My stomach lurched as I scrolled through comments, some expressing horror, others quick to speculate, and too many repeating the narrative my parents had always fed the world, that I was dramatic, unstable, always stirring conflict. Each word cut deeper than the stitches on my leg. Emotional undulation swung me between rage that strangers could judge me so easily and despair that they would likely side with Hannah, the polished older sister with a steady job and a loyal dog. Within hours, my workplace called the HR manager, speaking in a clipped voice about concerns regarding the company's reputation. She asked if I wanted to take a leave of absence while things calmed down. I tried to explain that I was the victim, that Hannah had orchestrated everything, but I could hear the hesitation in her tone. The same hesitation I had heard my whole life when people weighed whether to believe me or the image my family projected. Relief flickered when she mentioned counseling services the company would provide, but it was quickly smothered by the humiliation that my colleagues already knew, already whispered about me. Then came the legal pressure. A phone call late at night from a lawyer representing Hannah, his tone cold and aggressive. He threatened a civil suit, accusing me of provoking Zeus, claiming my so-called theatrics had caused the chaos, and insisting that Hannah had merely acted in self-defense of the children present. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. Mark grabbed it and hung up, telling me not to listen, but the seed of fear was already planted. What if the courts believed them? What if the world saw me as the instigator? Emotional undulation yanked me again, anger at their audacity colliding with the sinking weight of dread. Meanwhile, social media spun into a frenzy. Some neighbors posted supportive messages saying they had heard Hannah's command, but others accused me of lying, insisting I had always resented Hannah's success. Reading those words felt like standing naked in a storm pelted by stones I could not dodge. I shut my laptop, but the echo of their voices lingered in my head. Even walking into the pharmacy to pick up my medication, I felt eyes on me, whispers curling in the aisles. Shame pressed down heavy, threatening to crush the fragile resolve I had built. But then, Detective Wainwright called, her voice steady as a lifeline. She reassured me that the evidence was strong, that the video and the training records and the email painted a clear picture, but she also warned that the defense would go after me relentlessly. They would try to discredit me, to paint me as unstable. Her warning was not meant to scare, but to prepare. Emotional undulation surged as fear of the looming battle crashed over me, followed by a flicker of determination that I would not let Hannah steal my voice again. Mark encouraged me to write everything down, every memory, every detail of the attack, to strengthen my testimony. The act of writing became both painful and healing, forcing me to confront years of gaslighting, but also allowing me to see the pattern clearly. One evening, I sat at the table pen, shaking in my hand as I wrote about the moment my mother shouted, "She did right." My chest tightened, but by putting the words on paper, I reclaimed them, made them part of the record instead of a weapon used against me. Days blurred into each other, each one bringing new waves of pressure. A reporter showed up outside my apartment, shouting questions about family feuds and dog attacks. My neighbors avoided my eyes, uncomfortable with the spectacle. My phone buzzed constantly with blocked calls, some silent, others spewing threats. Emotional undulation became a daily rhythm, hope rising, when Mark reminded me of the proof despair sinking, when another cruel comment appeared online. Yet through it all, I began to feel something new, fragile but steady resistance. I was no longer just enduring. I was preparing. For the first time, I was not alone. I had Mark. I had Detective Wainwright. I had neighbors willing to testify. And even as the legal threats piled up and the social whispers grew louder, I could feel the tide beginning to shift. The truth was out there now, visible and undeniable, and though my parents and Hannah shouted the loudest, I was no longer the only one carrying it. The days after the threats and the social storm felt like walking a tightrope, where one wrong step could send me tumbling, but beneath the fear, a spark of resolve began to burn brighter. If Hannah and my parents wanted to twist the truth, then I would arm myself with proof that could not be denied. Mark became my anchor in this mission, arriving every morning with his laptop coffee and a determination that steadied me more than he realized. He set up folders labeled Evidence Witnesses Timeline, treating my life like a case file that deserved order and clarity. At first, I trembled each time I opened the folder, afraid of reliving the pain. But soon I felt a strange power in watching the narrative shift from chaos into structure. The photos of my wound taken daily became not just reminders of pain, but a sequence of undeniable facts, a visual timeline of injury that no words from Linda or Richard could erase. Detective Wainwright encouraged this documentation, reminding me that courts needed clarity, not emotion alone. Emotional undulation swept me as I sat under the harsh light of my kitchen staring at each photo, feeling the despair of reliving the bite, then the flicker of vindication knowing each image was a brick in the wall protecting me. One afternoon, Mark returned with something that made my breath catch. He had managed to retrieve snippets of Hannah's personal journal from a shared device she had once left logged in at a cousin's house. In neat handwriting, she had written about the satisfaction of seeing me falter about the control she felt when Zeus obeyed her, about how Claire will finally learn her place. My skin crawled reading it, but the detective's eyes lit with grim satisfaction when she saw the pages. This was not paranoia. This was admission. Emotional undulation surged again pain at seeing my name twisted into her sick pride, but strength rising, knowing it would be impossible to dismiss as fabrication. Slowly, the case grew thicker. Mark coordinated with the neighbor whose camera had caught the attack, ensuring the original files were preserved with timestamps, while another neighbor reluctantly admitted she had heard my mother say the words, "She did right," while I was screaming. Every testimony felt like a salve on an old wound, proof that for once the lies could not entirely cover the truth. Yet still the shadows pressed in. Anonymous messages flooded my inbox, calling me a liar, telling me to drop it some, even suggesting I deserved it. Emotional undulation dragged me downward, nights spent trembling in bed, afraid that Hannah would retaliate again. But therapy sessions with a counselor arranged by HR gave me small tools to fight the spiral. "Write it down," the counselor urged, and so I began journaling. Not just memories of abuse, but moments of strength, like the way my hands had pushed the picnic table to knock the knife away. That act, I realized, had saved me. It was proof that I was not weak, not passive. I was capable of fighting back. Building the case became more than gathering evidence. It became rebuilding myself. Mark pointed out that every time I added to the folder, my voice grew steadier. The detective confirmed that the district attorney was reviewing charges, and though fear curled in my stomach, pride flickered that my story mattered to the law. Emotional undulation rose as hope swelled in me, tempered by the dread of facing Hannah in court. Still, for the first time, I was no longer playing defense. I was preparing an offense. Each email printed, each witness statement gathered, each photo timestamped was a step toward reclaiming the narrative my family had stolen from me for decades. As I looked at the growing pile of binders and folders stacked on my dining table, I felt a quiet shift inside. They had spent years convincing me I was powerless, but now every piece of evidence whispered otherwise. I was not invisible. I was not crazy. I was ready. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and nerves, and as I sat at the plaintiff's table with the prosecutor beside me, my stomach twisted into knots that no amount of steady breathing could loosen. Months of gathering evidence had brought me here, but the sight of Hannah striding in with her lawyer at her side made the air grow heavy, as if the walls themselves leaned closer to watch. She wore a tailored navy dress, her hair perfectly styled, the picture of composure, but I knew what lay beneath. Our eyes met across the room, and for an instant I felt the same chill that had frozen me on the patio when she commanded Zeus. Emotional undulation struck immediately, a wave of fear threatening to drown me. Then a surge of defiance pulling me to the surface. I would not be erased today. The judge entered the gavel struck and the trial began. Hannah's lawyer wasted no time framing me as unstable, accusing me of provoking the dog, suggesting I had a history of exaggeration. My throat tightened as he spoke of me as though I were a stranger, a caricature crafted to be dismissed. But then the prosecutor rose, calm but firm, and played the video. The grainy image flickered on the courtroom screen, showing Hannah standing by the grill, her voice audible as she shouted the command. The sound of Zeus lunging filled the courtroom speakers, followed by my scream, and a ripple moved through the spectators. Emotional undulation surged again. Shame that everyone was watching my humiliation, relief that the truth was undeniable, anger that it had taken video proof to be believed. The prosecutor let the silence linger before calling the first witness. A neighbor testified that she had heard Hannah clearly, her hands trembling as she spoke, but her voice steady. Another confirmed seeing Hannah reach for the knife after the attack, his testimony punctuated by the clink of the knife being entered into evidence. My chest tightened as I listened, my heart aching with gratitude that someone beyond me carried the truth. Then came the blow that shifted the room. Detective Waywright presented the email from Linda. The words, "If she resists again, show her. She doesn't belong," glaring from the screen. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Richard leapt to his feet, shouting that it was taken out of context, that the family was being destroyed by lies, but the judge banged the gavel, warning him to sit down or be removed. Emotional undulation shook me violently. Grief that my father could still defend cruelty. Relief that his outburst revealed the bias to everyone watching. Hannah's lawyer tried to regain ground, questioning the authenticity of the journal pages Mark had retrieved, but the handwriting expert confirmed the match beyond doubt. The defense then shifted, arguing that my wound was exaggerated, but the medical records displayed photos of the bite stitches glistening under hospital lights, proof that could not be spun. My breath caught when my mother took the stand, her eyes darting nervously, her tone brittle as she insisted Hannah had only been protecting the family. Yet when cross-examined, her voice cracked and she admitted under pressure that she had written the email. The courtroom erupted in whispers, the weight of her admission sinking like a stone. Emotional undulation pulled me upward, heart pounding with vindication, only to crash again as she turned her gaze toward me and muttered that I had forced her hand, that I had brought shame to the family. The sting of those words nearly broke me, but the prosecutor pressed forward, calling more witnesses, layering fact upon fact. Then came the final strike, the training record from Zeus's sessions, showing that Hannah had specifically rehearsed commands linking me as the target. The trainer himself testified, his face grim, confirming that he had found it unusual, but had not questioned it at the time. The judge's expression hardened, the room silent, except for the scribble of the court reporter's keys. Emotional undulation reached a fever pitch in me, terror of the verdict clashing with relief that the truth was laid bare. Finally, the judge leaned forward, voice steady but heavy with gravity. The evidence clearly showed deliberate intent. He said that Hannah had used a trained animal as a weapon, that she had escalated with a knife, that her parents' support did not absolve her. He pronounced the sentence 12 years in prison for assault with a deadly weapon, with conditions including a lifetime ban on owning animals. The gavel struck, the sound echoing through my bones, and for the first time in years, I felt the crushing weight of my family's narrative lift, replaced by the raw weight of truth. Hannah's face twisted, the composure cracking her eyes, searing into me with hatred as officers moved to cuff her. Richard shouted that the judge was biased. Linda sobbed that her daughter was being taken, but none of it mattered now. Emotional undulation surged again. Relief flooding me so fast I nearly collapsed. Grief that my parents would never stand on my side. Anger that it had come to this, hope that justice had finally spoken. As Hannah was led away, the prosecutor placed a hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "You fought back," he said simply, and though my body trembled with exhaustion, I knew he was right. For once, I had not been silenced. For once, the truth had been louder than their lies. When the courtroom emptied and the echo of the gavel still pulsed in my ears, I felt as though I had stepped out of a storm into an unfamiliar silence, one that was both comforting and disorienting. Hannah was gone. Escorted in cuffs, my parents had stormed out, shouting promises of appeals and curses against me. And yet I sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, unable to move, as if my body did not quite believe it was over. Mark placed his hand over mine and whispered that it was done, that justice had been spoken, and slowly the weight pressing on my chest began to loosen. Emotional undulations swept through me, a surge of relief so strong it brought tears, then a crash of grief that my own mother and father had chosen to defend cruelty, then a spark of resolve that I would not let their betrayal define the rest of my life. In the weeks that followed, the world adjusted to the new reality. Zeus was taken by animal control and evaluated, and though the bite he delivered had scarred my leg, the experts determined he was not inherently dangerous, but had been conditioned. They sent him to a specialized training facility where he would be retrained and eventually placed with handlers who would ensure he was never used as a weapon again. Hearing this stirred a swirl of emotions: anger at how Hannah had twisted him into a tool for harm, sorrow for the loyal animal caught in human malice, relief that he would not be destroyed but given another chance. Emotional undulation played across my heart as I processed it all, but ultimately I knew it was right. I could not blame Zeus for obeying the command drilled into him. The scar on my leg remained tender, a jagged line that caught in the mirror each morning, but instead of shame, it began to feel like a badge, a reminder of what I had survived. My parents did not visit me, did not call except once when my mother left a voicemail filled with sobs insisting I had ruined the family, that Hannah's imprisonment was my fault. I deleted it without replying, my hand shaking but my resolve steady. For the first time, I allowed myself to understand that their love had always been conditional, tethered to obedience and silence, and I would no longer bend to it. Therapy became a constant sessions with a counselor who helped me unravel the knots of guilt and doubt that had been tied around me for years. Each appointment was a climb, some days leaving me raw and shaken, other days lifting me higher. But slowly, a pattern emerged. I was learning to trust myself to hear my own voice without filtering it through their judgment. Emotional undulation remained moments of darkness still ambushing me in the night dreams where Hannah's voice shouted the command again. But daylight brought resilience. Mark stayed close, inviting me into spaces that felt like family without the poison of blood ties. He introduced me to friends who listened without judgment, who laughed with me over coffee, who celebrated small victories like me walking without the cane for the first time. They became a chosen family, and in their presence I felt the warmth of belonging I had been denied for so long. One evening, months after the sentencing, I walked along the beach with Mark, the waves foaming at our feet, and I carried the old cane I no longer needed. At the water's edge, I left it on the sand, watching the tide reach for it, and I whispered aloud that I was done carrying what had been forced on me. The sea swept it away, and I felt lighter scarred but unbroken. Emotional undulation rose one last time, grief for what I had lost, triumph for what I had reclaimed. I began volunteering at a support center for others who had survived family betrayal and violence, sharing pieces of my story not as wounds to reopen, but as bridges for others to cross. Each time, someone nodded in recognition. Each time someone whispered, "Thank you for speaking." I felt the purpose growing inside me. Hannah's hatred had scarred me, but it would not silence me. My parents' rejection still ached, but it no longer defined me. I had forged something new, something stronger. On quiet mornings, I sat with my journal writing, not just memories of pain, but visions of the life I was building. Dinners with friends, laughter echoing without fear, therapy sessions that ended with hope rather than despair. The bite had marked my skin, but it no longer marked my spirit. It was simply part of my story, not the end of it. Emotional undulation calmed into a rhythm still present, but no longer violent like waves that could lift me without drowning me. One afternoon, standing at the community center after leading a group session, I caught my reflection in the window, and for the first time in years, I saw not the scapegoat of my family, not the target of Hannah's jealousy, but a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had stared down betrayal and walked away stronger. I smiled at that reflection, a small smile, but one filled with truth. The journey ahead was still long scars, both visible and invisible, still tender. But I was moving forward one step at a time, no longer looking back to see if my family approved. The echo of my father's voice calling me dramatic, my mother's scream of "She did right!" Hannah's cold stare as she ordered the attack. They would always live in my memory, but they no longer owned me. I owned myself. And that truth was the justice I had been denied for too long. When I think back on that day at the barbecue, the scar on my leg and the scars inside my heart, I know I will never be the same person I was before Hannah shouted that command. But I also know that the woman writing these words now is stronger, clearer, and no longer willing to be silenced. The courtroom gave me justice therapy, gave me healing, and building a new chosen family gave me a sense of belonging I had never known. Yet, what truly keeps me moving forward is the idea that my story might help someone else who feels trapped in the shadows of betrayal. If you are listening to this, if you are sitting in your living room or lying awake at night with the weight of family judgment crushing your chest, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not alone. Emotional undulation never ends completely. I still wake up some nights with Hannah's voice echoing in my mind, still flinch when I hear a dog bark too sharply, still feel my father's words burning when I think of the times he called me dramatic. But now those echoes remind me of how far I have come, of the strength I never knew I had, of the power that comes from telling the truth, even when people try to bury it. Healing is not a straight line, and justice is not always delivered neatly in a courtroom. But reclaiming your own voice is possible, and it begins with refusing to believe the lies you have been fed. For years, I believed I was too sensitive, too weak, too dramatic, the scapegoat of a family that thrived on control. Now I see that my sensitivity is strength, that my willingness to question their cruelty was never weakness, that my survival is proof of my resilience. If you have been made to doubt yourself, to question your own memories, to swallow your pain, because speaking it out loud only brings ridicule, then let my story be your proof that those tactics are not truth. They are weapons, and like any weapon, they can be disarmed. I want to speak especially to those of you over 50 who are listening, because I know many of you carry decades of silent pain. Perhaps you endured a sibling who was favored while you were ignored, or parents who dismissed your tears as drama, or a partner who chipped away at your confidence until you could no longer recognize yourself. Perhaps you still replay those moments in the quiet hours of the night, wondering if you overreacted, if it was really as bad as you remember. I am here to tell you that your memory is valid, your feelings are real, and your pain is not imaginary. The world may try to minimize what you lived, but your scars, visible or invisible, are proof of your truth. I used to think justice was something delivered from the outside, a verdict stamped by a judge, a sentence handed down. And while that matters, while seeing Hannah led away in cuffs gave me a sense of closure, I learned that real justice begins inside. It begins the moment you say no more, the moment you refuse to accept blame for wounds inflicted on you, the moment you decide that you deserve peace. That decision is terrifying because it often means losing the approval of those you once loved, but it is also liberating beyond measure. I will never have my parents' love in the way I once longed for it, but I have my freedom, my dignity, and the chance to build relationships based on respect instead of fear. If you are at the crossroads of silence and truth, I urge you to choose truth. It will hurt. It will shake the ground beneath your feet, but it will also open the door to a future where you can breathe without shame. Emotional undulation will still be part of that journey. You will have days where the pain feels fresh, where the betrayal cuts deep again, but each wave will remind you that you are alive, that you are still moving forward, that the tide does not control you. My scar reminds me daily that I survived not just a dog bite, but decades of being told I was nothing. And every time I see it, I whisper to myself, I am still here. I want you to whisper the same to yourself, whatever your scar may be. I am still here. And being here is enough reason to keep fighting for peace. If you found yourself caught up in my story, I ask you to take one small action today. Maybe it is sharing your own memory in the comments. Maybe it is picking up a pen and writing down something you were told to forget. Maybe it is simply saying out loud that what happened to you was real. These small steps are how healing begins, and when we share them together, we break the silence that abusers and manipulators depend on. And if you know someone who is going through something like this, do not look away. Do not let fear of conflict silence you. Be the neighbor who speaks up. Be the cousin who refuses to stay quiet. Be the friend who says, I believe you. You may never know how much that act can save someone, but I promise it matters more than you realize. As I close this chapter of my life, I feel a mix of exhaustion and hope, grief for the family I never truly had, and gratitude for the new one I am building. The road ahead will not be free of obstacles, but it will be mine, and that is something no one can take away again. Thank you for walking this road with me, for listening to my story, for giving weight to words that once felt like whispers in the dark. Now I ask you directly, if you have ever been betrayed by those closest to you, what would you do in my place? Would you stay silent to keep the peace, or would you risk everything to tell the truth? Share your thoughts, share your strength, and let this channel be a place where silence ends and healing begins. Because no matter how deep the scars, no matter how loud the voices that try to erase us, we are still here. And being here is our victory.